Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. And as I said, we're now all members of the same school, so I hope there'll be something here of interest to you. What I wanted to do today was talk about, and actually, again, a second thank you was I actually get the chance to sit back and think about what I've been doing for the last 25 years. Because I thought, since we're new to the school and you've invited me to introduce myself, I thought that's what I would actually do. So this is really what sets the framework that I've been working in and talks about one of the projects I've been working on with my colleagues. But this is just one part of what we're doing. And in fact, I think it's probably not what I was invited here originally to do, which was to talk about Staples theory. But I'm happy to come back and talk about that at another time. What I want to talk today is a project that I've been working on with two of my colleagues who are equally responsible here. Eric Shepard from the University of California, Los Angeles, and Bob Haining, who is from Cambridge University. And this is really a project we've been working on in various components for probably about 25 years. So you'll forgive me if I skip over some of the details here. What I want to do today is to really set up an idea for how geographers, and I'm an economic geographer by training, and how geographers look at capitalism and how geographers look at the space economy. And to contrast that a little with how economists have looked at economic geography through what's called the new geographical economics that was promulgated particularly by Paul Krugman and his colleagues. And I would point out immediately that economic geography is a very broad church. So this is only two perspectives of multiple ontologies that exist within economic geography. So what I want to do today is to set out what the differences are, but do that in a context that I hope you'll find interesting, related to the nature of spatial competition. And this is just one of the examples we've been working on. If we think of this in terms of really a dualism or a dichotomy, the neoclassical economic approach that is associated particularly with Paul Krugman is really an attempt, I think, to take space seriously within the context of a monopolistically competitive model. And I think what we're trying to do is look at four different dimensions of this. First is the spatiality of this. As a geographer, that's what I'm interested in. And what I want to convince you today, if nothing else, and it's what I want to convince everyone whenever I talk, is that geography and space matter, okay? If they don't, then I need to find another discipline, okay? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I don't know. At the end of this, you'll say, you need to find another discipline. So I think there are key distinctions between neoclassical economic geography and the way they approach problems of spatial competition and the way in which we would approach it from what I think of as a political economy perspective. And that's space, time, how they view economic structures, and also the notion of agency. And we've written quite extensively about the relationship between structures and agency here. And the principal contrast here is with regional political economy. And this is an approach that I've been developing with Eric in particular. I put Bob Haining probably on the periphery of this because I've known Bob for many years, and he's really a spatial statistician, and he's interested in statistical issues more than economic issues. At least until, you notice, he's retired. He's now, I saw him recently, he said he's retired from Cambridge and he's taken a philosophy course. And I've been trying for 20 years to get him interested in philosophy. And he said, Paul, this guy Wittgenstein you've been talking about, he's really interesting, isn't he? So now we've started an online conversation about Wittgenstein. So that's what you can do when you retire. And there are four real dimensions in which I want to talk about. And I suspect this dimension will be familiar to a lot of you as economists. Is the notion here is you start from the notion of your explanations need to be grounded in micro foundations. So aggregates are reduced to individual, autonomous, self-interested actors that are fully informed or informed up to the limits of their informational and computational abilities. The second is the notion in geographical economics on the emphasis on spatial equilibrium. And that is, what does the configuration of prices, profits, and outputs look when markets clear and profits are maximized? And the third element of this really is that space, even within Krugman's formulation, is reduced to either homogeneous space, in what we used to call in geography uniform plane. How do you build up a geography from a uniform plane where you assume everything is equal? And where you assume exogenous or fixed transportation costs, or what was called iceberg transportation costs after Samuelson's formulation. And this is the idea they're exogenous to the economic system. So economic activity takes place on the geography here, as it were. And the contrast with this is with what we've been trying to do in political economy, is think of, and geography is to think of particularly space as different. Space here is heterogeneously constructed, and I'll show you what that means later. And also, that means in a sense it's inherently uneven, and we start from the idea that it's uneven, and the unevenness is constructed and part of the process. So we're looking at the relationship here between economic and spatial processes, and trying to get away from, excuse me, I'm recovering from cold. The issue of spatiality as a homogeneous space really dates back to the 1930s with particularly Kristalla and Lersch, and it was in the assumptions of early quantitative economic geography. And it's guilty of what we call spatial fetishism. You look at the pattern rather than the process behind it, or you try to infer the process from the pattern. And thinking of space as heterogeneous and constructed is a way we're trying to get around this. The second is that we view the system as inherently non-equilibrium. It's non-equilibrating, it's out of equilibrium, but more so, it's also a conflict-ridden process. It's not some sort of competitive adjustment mechanism towards an equilibrium. There are both equilibrating and disequilibrating tendencies in the system. And also, the production takes time. So production takes place under conditions of fundamental uncertainty. And we've been developing some more aggregate regional economic models that look at this explicitly. I'm not going to look at those today, because I want to really discuss with you the difference between these on the grounds of geographical economics. So we're considering a case where geographical economics, as in neoclassical economic geography, is at its strength. I will add here one final thing, which is we've also, the theories of production that we've been working on are in stark contrast to those assumed by Krugman and his associates, and really build on multi-sector and multi-regional interdependencies in models in what's called the surplus approach that draw very much on the work of Straffer and the Cambridge School of Economics. Again, I'd love to come back and give you another lecture on those sometimes. That would be very entertaining, because that's where we can put transport explicitly in the model. Okay, so that's the background. The argument is, because we're seeing a situation in which we think of the economic system as structurally complex and conflict-ridden and evolving, and that space is endogenous to the system, we need in economic geography a different set of methodological norms to those that you would employ in economics. And we've become interested recently in looking at this, and this is why it's called mathematical dialectics, is looking at this from a dialectical perspective. So the idea here is, instead of focusing on things, we're focusing on the relations of understanding relation between things. The emphasis is not on representative agents, but on the heterogeneity of agents and internal contradictions that emerge from within those systems, so the unintended consequences of intentional action. And also the emphasis here is on transformative behaviours, how systems get in. It's not saying equilibrium is not a place you will be found, but it has to emerge from the economic processes that you're actually postulating. And this is a quote from David Harvey, who's an economic geographer, who, when I started on this, I had no background in dialectics and didn't understand dialectics, and probably still don't. But I understood what David Harvey wrote, because for many years he taught in a school of engineering where he had to explain to engineers what dialectics was. So where this, I think, rather nice quote comes from about dialectics in the system. So, what I would argue here, or what we tried to argue in a number of papers, is because we have a vision of the capitalist space economy as disequilibrating, or a different ontology that doesn't start from micro foundations, the appropriate methodological norms we have are slightly different. And we've argued elsewhere that we employ something called the Goodwin Code, which is after the economist Richard Goodwin. And his notion, he looked a lot, and there are really three parts to his explanation. The first is that if we're going to use mathematics, it has to be the mathematics of nonlinear systems. So that means we need to look at the global behaviour of systems, theoretically, and it's not enough to look at local approximations and local stability conditions if you're going to understand how systems operate. The second is that economic structure is made up of elements that are interdependent, whether these be intersectoral, interregional, and also there's heterogeneity within that. And the third is that agency is through out of equilibrium, where we have to model actual processes, not fictitious Raoultizing and Tatonement types processes. And that's really the concept that links structure and dynamics. In regional political economy, we take an approach called probabilistic political economy. So if we're looking at an equilibrium, as we're going to today, we're looking at really the existence and stability conditions of a spatial price equilibrium in this case, as a stochastic or statistical equilibrium. And where aggregate prices and profits form something of look like the mean variance relationship in stochastic variables. That's either the mean variance across sectors, across regions, or across firms. And the foundations of this was really from two mathematicians who wrote in the 1980s, I think, a book called The Laws of Chaos, which was trying to argue that you could, if you looked at statistical mechanics, you could solve Marx's transformation problem. Okay, for today, what I want to concentrate on is trying to use these methods to get at three questions. And this is related to spatial price competition in a particular market. The first is, under what conditions do disequilibrium dynamics lead to the emergent property of an equilibrium? And then what does that mean for the configuration of prices, profits, and outputs? The second is, what are the implications of out of equilibrium price output adjustments for rationality within that system? And the third, as I said, and this is really my bailiwick here, is what difference does space make here? That's both in terms of the relative location of firms within a spatial market, but also once you endogenize space. So it's interdependencies and its relative location. Okay, that's fairly general. That gives you a sense of what the project is. Yeah, sure.
Just to clarify, are you then specifically referring to the Prigogine approach, Prigogine model? Or, I forget the other name, the Danish guy. So it's out of equilibrium dynamics, but is it close to, out of, far away from? So Prigogine is far away from.
Yeah, very good question. That's a very good question.
I mean, or just a clarification. That
yeah, I'm not at this. I wouldn't say. I think this is. Can we leave that? I'm thinking more in terms of computation. I'm going to say later different types of dynamics classified according to what's called the Wolfram-Chomsky classification of complexity. So I think it can encompass both, but it also encompasses issues of equilibrium as well. So the assumption isn't a priori that you're far from equilibrium or close to it. This is an assumption that is used. Actually, I know Kirsten is here. She works on evolutionary economic geography, and I've done some work in this area. And that tends to be an assumption of evolutionary economic geography, is that you're far from equilibrium and you're not going back to it. My approach, because I'm grounded in traditional deductive theorem proof mathematics, so I'm uncomfortable with assuming that. I would like that to come out as a proof of something, whether it's far or close to equilibrium. But it's certainly within that tradition. I think it's more within a tradition of the sort of John Holland complexity type dynamics as well. But again, I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards, because I have a colleague who, sorry, I'm going to get a little bit distracted here. Not on this paper, we did a paper on interregional dynamics with price quantity adjustments with Luke Bergman, who's a colleague of mine at University of Washington. And Luke's a younger guy. He's a physicist, trained as a physicist. And I kept, when we were working together, I kept waiting to write the equations down and solve them. And Luke was programming the computer. And I said, well, where's the model? And he said, well, no, this is the model. So it's a really different modeling style as well that I find a bit, I think it's actually more productive, but I find it quite challenging. So that's a long answer to your question. But thank you. You'll see later how this emerges out. I think you'll like some of the graphs we're going to show. Okay. Gosh, I'm realising. So the case we're considering here is a very simple case. The simplest case we could probably think of that was consistent with geographical economics. And think of this as a spatial market, obviously. And the best way to think of this, and it's not, don't get hung up on the example, is petrol pricing. And the idea here is that you have sites within an urban market. And within this urban market, so these are the retail sites, consumers make choices on where they're going to buy their petrol or gas, if you will. Depends on where I'm giving the talk. And there's a structure, obviously, here. This is a network. Kirsten, we've been talking about this, about networks. This is a network on structure. So the structure of the network is defined by the WJIs here. This is the geographic structure. And the idea here is that each retail site can define its local market area. But in contradiction to a lot of what happens in economic geography, typically the assumption is very deterministic. People go to their nearest retailer. Here the assumption is people behave probabilistically. They can behave either rationally or randomly within this model. And this is really a random, you can think of this as a random utility model, if you like, or random choice model.
Is W a coordinate?
No, Wij is a matrix of a binary matrix. So if you're directly connected, so this is really defines what the network is. So this site here is directly connected to this, and this is directly connected to this. But of course, if you power up this thing, everything's related to everything else indirectly, yeah? So this is a binary matrix. And the assumption here is that people's decision on where to buy depends on two things. Is the relative prices of these locations, but also some sort of measure here of the information available to them, yeah? You can generalize this. You could make the Wij a function of transportation costs as well, which we've done, and it doesn't affect any of the proofs that we have. But effectively, this is a excuse me, a traditional spatial interaction model. And for geographers, this is the sort of model I grew up on. This is what you learn as potential models, spatial interaction models. Nowadays, I see in international trade theory, gravity models have become very popular. If there's anyone here working on them, I'd be very interested to talk to them, because there's some stuff that comes out of geography I think would be. We're dealing with a similar set of issues in terms of econometrically issues of endogeneity, certainly. But the idea here is that sales depend on a fixed level of demand originating in each site. And so effectively, these are the probabilities of starting in J and buying at I. So this is the consumer choice here. So this is an allocation mechanism of demand within the urban area. Now, the idea here is there are a limited number of firms engaged in oligopolistic competition. And what we've done in a series of papers, and I'm happy to provide those, but I don't want to get hung up on them today, is really consider what the equilibrium characteristics are like and what the stability conditions are for four different scenarios, or four different possibilities. First is assuming that firms operating in this market choose to maximize their total profits, which is consistent with a neoclassical approach. And the second is that when firms are trying to maximize the rate of profit on the capital they've advanced, which is a more familiar approach in post-Keynesian and Straffin economics. And the second is to consider two different price adjustment scenarios out of equilibrium. The first of these is a partial adjustment model, or local adjustment. And the second is a Bertrand game, which is a Nash type of game, but Nash in prices rather than quantities. What I want to look at today, just for simplicity, is to look what happens when firms are trying or do maximize their total profits, and they're gradient climbing in the sense that they're following a local price adjustment strategy. So, and this, as I said, is consistent with a lot of the work that's taking place in evolutionary economic geography at the moment. If we do this, and I didn't know whether you wanted me to concentrate on solving all of this, but yeah, sure.
Is there any time dimension in it?
Time dimension?
Yeah, in this formula.
In what sense?
So like there is a time, it will take some time to adjust, or it will take some time to the information to pass from one actor to another actor.
Yes. Is the answer. Well, I'll show you what the partial adjustment model looks. Essentially, the partial adjustment model assumes that you adjust your prices, observe what happens before other firms change their prices. It's a conjectural variation model, whereas the Nash equilibrium model is assuming that all this is solved somehow hypothetically instantaneously as a sort of artificial process. Yeah. It turns out the stability conditions for those are identical. But yeah, there's two. That is a time dimension, but it's not time in the sense of Prigognine's idea of irreversible time or historical time. So it's a logical time. Okay. How am I doing for time here? Okay. If we solve this for a Nash equilibrium, and we can prove that at least one equilibrium exists, then you get a set of spatial equilibrium prices that look like this. And this is, the best way to think of this is the pricing equation, if you take costs as fixed here, is the price depends on a mean variance relationship here. So this is, if you like, the mean or the expected level of demand, and this is the variability around this. Or the other way to think of this is an inverse of an elasticity. But the idea here is that only under the price here is going to vary. There isn't going to be a uniform price across the market here, as you would get in a typical hoteling model, for example. What you get here is differentials in prices at equilibrium that depend on the probabilities here. So they're depending explicitly on the spatial structure or the spatial network that you're operating on, and also the relative price differentials and the information or index of the beta there is an allocation mechanism. I was going to say it's not an index of rationality though. Okay, so those are the that's the equilibrium condition. Again, if you're interested in this, we've written 2 or 3 papers actually looking at these configurations and how they look under different spatial network structures. What I want to point out here today is one of the findings of this is about spatial equilibrium rate of profit, which is this here. And this says that basically that one of the things we found was differences in the degree of monopoly, and this is a measure of the inverse of the elasticity is a measure of degree of monopoly, give rise to permanent differences in profit rates in a manner analogous to differential rates. So think of von Thunen's kind of models here, for example. And free entry does not imply a long-run equilibrium where all firms make minimum profits. So profits don't above normal profits don't disappear in this model. There's always a locational advantage depending on your relative location in the market and also depending on the nature of the interdependencies between those markets. Consequently, the traditional argument that profits may be neglected under free entry is inapplicable to the reality of spatially heterogeneous markets. And that's the first way in which space makes a difference here. It's only in, you'd have to come up with a hypothetical case in which, as geographers said long ago, the problem with many economists, I realise I'm in, problem with many economists is they assume that production and consumption take place on the head of a pin. If you're willing to assume that production and consumption take place on the head of a pin, then you can get round this. Okay? Otherwise, you've got to accept the fact they're going to be above normal profits, and you two need to explain where those come from. And so this really, yeah, sure.
So, how we define profit here is very important.
Absolutely.
Because I'm thinking about the Celtic station at the Celtic station at the corner, and if I know because of its location it's making a bit of profit, if I am the landlord, I'm going to siphon off that extra profit. Right? So, if a place has an advantage in terms of being profitable, then it doesn't mean that profit is going to stay there. So land prices and so on are going to change.
Maybe. No, not necessarily. I mean, yes, there is a different, just as there is in a von Thunen kind of model, there's differential rent. Yeah? So you would argue, if there's a perfectly competitive land market, that will get bid away. Yes? In a sort of Ricardian kind of rent scenario?
Yeah, but if you have free entry, what's going to happen is that the rents will be bid up.
Yes, but at the margins, yes, but this is arguing even if you do that, there's always going to be an extra marginal profit, an excess profit over and above that.
The market is going up to the CI.
The CI is going to change.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you, yeah, absolutely. Well, the assumption here is the CI doesn't change. And if, yeah. I've actually, my PhD was actually endogenizing the CI, allowing for corporations to control and charge a monopoly rent over that. And it turns out that under those conditions, the system becomes totally unstable.
What is endogenized?
Yeah, once we allow for corporate control, and oligopolistic, basically becomes a two-stage game with oligopolistic competition at each level. And you can't, to solve that problem is very complex. Yeah, Can we just? I understand your point, and I think yes, it's very fair to say. But then you're pushing. All you're doing is pushing back the problem one stage, because then if you're looking at the land market, you've got to talk about monopoly rent as well, and from a Marxist perspective, you've got to talk about class monopoly rent. Yeah, and so it doesn't get rid of the problem; it just pushes it back one stage further, and you have to assume we've got a perfectly competitive land market. I think. Okay. Thanks for the great questions. I like that. Okay. Oh, gosh, I realise I'm getting short of time here. Okay. So we asked the question. I'm going to rush through this a bit. We've defined what a Nash equilibrium is. We asked the question in the paper, why should we care about a Nash equilibrium? Why does it make a difference? And I love this quote from Ken Binmore about this. It's saying there are two major reasons. The first supposes that ideally rational players reason their way to a solution of the game. The second supposes that people find their way to a solution by some evolutionary trial and error process. Much of the predictive power of game theory arises from the possibility of passing back and forth between these two alternative interpretations. And in the paper behind this, we discussed this in more detail. We seldom know much about the details of the evolutionary process, but we can sometimes leap ahead to predict where they will eventually end up by asking what rational players would do in the situations under study, which I think is a very fair representation of what I think is a fair representation of why we should care about Nash equilibrium. Now I'm going to try and convince you that we shouldn't care about Nash equilibrium, of course. And this is because this addresses your question. For both the Bertrand game, but also for the partial adjustment, which I'm considering today, we assume here that this is the prices adjust by some speed of adjustment and the partial derivative of profits with respect to prices. So it's really own prices. If you wanted to use the total differential here, please be my guest and send me the equations because I couldn't solve it. But this basically assumes that there's two outcomes here. You could either go, the ideally rational actor, it's an artificial process, solves all this in his or her head and can go straight to the equilibrium. That's really what it means by ideal rational. As far as I understand Nash equilibrium, you assume you know the set of all possible outcomes for you and everybody else. Yeah? It's sort of godlike behaviour. Or you can assume, as you do here, you have some sort of evolutionary gradient climbing process, which here depends on prices and the set of parameters, which I'm running out of time to go into. The reason I mention this is what we can prove is for this particular spatial pricing problem is that a sufficient condition for spatial price equilibrium price vector to be locally stable is that the Jacobian matrix is diagonally dominant, or you've got negative eigenvalues on all the main elements evaluated at the equilibrium prices. And what we can prove is that we look at the global and local stability conditions in general, but for both in this case for the total profit model, these are the elements of the Jacobian, from which it follows that the absolute value of the sum of the off-diagonal elements is equal to the absolute value of the diagonal elements, which means that the process is only locally quasi-stable. So it's very, very weak stability conditions here. This is saying this is an equilibrium, yes, but it's not particularly stable. We can't prove much about stability. Yeah? And I would suggest then this means that if this is the case, yeah, sure.
So this depends on linearizing the solution around the equilibrium points, sort of using that trick rather than looking at global stability.
The proof of local stability does. We have a proof of global stability that doesn't rely on that, but we can't for this particular case we can't prove that. So this isn't just linearizing around the fixed point. This is definitely. It's taking the second order conditions of a Taylor series.
That's a sort of standard trick in economics. You linearize around the fixed point and then you say, well, it's stable around there, but I don't know. Globally in this model, I probably don't know what's going on.
Yeah, and yes, yes and no, because I'm never willing to. Yes, you're right. That's exactly what you're doing. But actually, you've anticipated my next point. Which is that we've actually done this is to try to say, okay, what I've tried to argue here is because you only have local stability, that doesn't really give you much support for the predictive power of Nash equilibrium. Yeah, if you're only locally quasi-stable. Yeah. Whereas, I mean, Richard Goodwin had a great phrase. He said, equilibrium is of a limited relevance if it's the one place the system's never found. Yeah. Which I love.
Yeah, that does answer my earlier question then. But it's not the preclusion approach.
No.
It's the on-saga approach.
It was?
On-saga approach, which is you can only say something which is actually only, in the languages of equilibrium, only a little bit away from equilibrium.
Yeah.
Otherwise, all bets are off.
Analytically, all bets are off, yes. But what we've tried to do, is to try and look at this in terms of, this is when I resort to computer simulation, to try and look at the types of dynamics that are possible. And yeah, you're right, so we're trying to look beyond, as you said, it's mathematically, local stability is, I mean, it's not even local in a meaningful economic sense. It's in a sort of mathematical, this is based on a thing called a Gregorian's disk, which is a mathematical space, not an economic space. Yeah? So it really is right, when they say in the local stability right in the neighborhood, it really is, yeah. Epsilon, exactly, yes. And that's what the global stability prop is. I think we used alpha instead of epsilon just to be cool, you know.
I reckon Bob really enjoyed this interaction, but we're going to have to be quiet if he's going to get in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm about halfway through. Thanks for that, David. As Kirsten knows, I love to talk. Unfortunately, I also love to tell stories, and I've got lots of stories behind all this. What I'll do is I'll rush through maybe a bit quicker. We won't spend much time on this. This is something I'm very interested in, and starting to work on something on coding dynamics as well, but we can talk about that later. What we're trying to do is to say, what we considered was a series of computer simulations, again on the territory of geographical economics, of looking at just first-order spatial interdependencies for homogeneous and heterogeneous markets bounded, and we varied the size of the markets and the nature of interdependencies. But what I'm going to show you today is, because we've got about 5 minutes here, is what results did we get? What did we find? The first is that for and these are for varying the speed of adjustment, is we get oscillations towards equilibrium. So we get type 1 behavior. There is an emergent equilibrium at low speeds of adjustment. As you increase the speeds of adjustment, you get bounded periodic behaviors, which we would argue is of type 2 on the complexity measures. And these are both spatial and temporal cycles. I once presented this to a group of physicists at the University of Wisconsin who loved it because they said, oh, this is plasma dynamics. And they sent me a whole series of papers that I never understood, but it is, I think. I think it was the Reds that really got them into thinking it was plasma. Some of our physical geography colleagues might think of this as... The third is we get aperiodic behavior here, where they're not exploding, they're not settling down. And this is what we're talking about. This is more, I think of this as more something that maybe is locally unstable but globally stable. A bit like a strange attractor. Yeah. I mean, but you have to explore, because of the complexity, you have to explore these from computer simulations. You can't solve it, I can't solve it analytically. Okay. So that's the first thing, is that we can get a range of behaviours that are non-equilibrium behaviours, but that are meaningful, at least within my terms of reference. This also has an economically plausible interpretation, and geographically as well, because the argument is at very slow speeds of adjustment, what happens is you go to equilibrium, because not only is the adjustment slow, but the local price adjustments are slow as well. In other words, you're only considering what's happening to your nearest neighbour, and this is not concatenating throughout the whole system of interdependencies. But as the speed of adjustment increases, what happens is, in a sense, the local interactions become global, as you get second, third, and fourth order effects that concatenate throughout the market. And the last, of course, is we would argue here you're actually getting self-sustaining price structures as well. And this is analogous to some stuff I've been reading on by Herb Gintis, who's looked at this in very similar markets, but instead of geographic space, in commodity space, and Walrasian adjustment mechanisms, where he finds that there are cycles of prices, outputs, and profits at Walrasian equilibrium, which it's very interesting work, I think. Okay, I'm going to be on time, believe it or not. The last thing we looked at is... Not the last thing, the next thing we looked at is it rational to actually experiment with non-equilibrium prices, which wouldn't make sense in the sense of the way we think of Nash. And what we've done is a series of experiments, and I'm showing one here, in which we've done is it's a market with 49 sites on it, and what we've done is randomly perturbated these, drawing from a uniform distribution. And these are just two examples for the homogeneous and heterogeneous market. And there are really 3 points here. The first is that, in general, what you find at, if firms experiment by lowering their prices out of equilibrium, then these are net cumulative profits over the adjustment, and this is adjustment towards equilibrium. What you find is that if firms lower their prices, net over the adjustment to equilibrium, they actually lose profits. But what you find is if firms raise their prices, they actually gain profits. And the argument, I think, to support this is that because of the limited spatial interdependencies we have here and consumer sensitivities, the spatial allocation mechanism isn't strong enough to reassign demand to these sites because they've lowered their prices. The second is that there are exceptions to this, and this I think highlights the importance that space matters as well, or location effects. The first is at these sites here that I've identified, what you have is firms that initially raise their prices. I think these, maybe I've got this back to front. Let's go to location 30 here. This is a firm that initially lowered its price, but ends up with cumulative. I've got this back to front. Anyway, you get the paradox of what you would expect in that if it's lowering its price here, because it's surrounded by firms that have raised their price, over its net accumulation is it's making total profits, excess total profits. So it's the reverse of what you would expect because of the local effects here. And this is something that was first identified by Lersch in the 1930s, the possibilities that even within homogeneous spaces you can get local spatial effects and local spatial clusters. Okay, I realise I'm 2 minutes over time here. There's so much more I could say, but let's finish up. Okay, what have I tried to convince you of today? The first is that of the social-spatial dialectic is that we need to look at more than these smooth processes, a harmonious process adjusting towards spatial equilibrium. We need to consider non-equilibrium processes and also look at, I think, probabilistically. So you see that we're looking at mean variance relationships here. We're accounting for the heterogeneity underlying these models. And we've started, I've been working on this now, looking at interregional models especially. The second is this is perfectly consistent with what you would expect from a Marxist conception of competition, particularly the adjustment mechanisms that have been posited for price quantity adjustments out of what they call centres of gravitation or long-run prices of production. And again, I can talk about that in more detail. That's secondary. The most important thing, and this is the takeaway for today, if anything is the takeaway, is that geography matters here because you get non-zero profits because of location advantage, persistent out-of-equilibrium dynamics, non-Nash equilibrium with incentives for rational firms to disequilibrate because they're making excess profits. And we would argue that calls the rationality and intended consequences into question because there are unintended consequences here from price adjustments. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening and thank you for your questions, and I'm, of course, willing to answer any other questions.
Thank you.